The RS4 Pro is a compact gimbal, but it's strong enough to fly cameras like my FX6 with a 24-70 or a cinema lens. After using it to make my review, I've learned a lot about this gimbal, and I have a few opinions about how to get the best image out of the RS4 Pro. First, we'll go over some tips, and then I'll get into some shortcuts. First up, and I'm not even going to count this as a tip, but it is to update the firmware on everything. I know this is a boring tip, but it is absolutely necessary to take time and set everything up properly if you want to get the best results out of this gimbal. Make sure if you update the firmware on one thing, you also check other devices to make sure they're all on the same firmware or the latest firmware. So if you're having issues, definitely check if there's an update. The first real tip is to balance and calibrate your motors when you add anything. The motors are 20% stronger, but with all these accessories you'll be putting on this gimbal, or even if you just swap a lens, to get the proper best results out of this gimbal, you will want to make sure everything is calibrated and tuned. The more you add to this gimbal, the more you need to check the balance and recalibrate. My second tip is to learn the follow settings. Learning the difference between pan tilt follow, pan follow, and FPV doesn't really take that much time, but what takes more time and will see better results is adjusting each axis to what shoot you want to get. For example, in FPV mode, my pan axis is typically the highest, my tilt axis is a little bit lower, and my roll is almost off. However, if the shoot calls for something to be spinning around, that's when I know I need to crank up my roll axis all the way almost, and probably turn down the tilt and pan. This is something that takes experimentation, and the more you do this and the more you want to get creative with this gimbal, the more this is going to pay off. If you're just filming anything, panning slowly around, learning the sensitivity in and out of what each axis does will help you get the best results using the RS4. My next tip is to know which accessories you need and which accessories you don't need at all. Initially, I was going to just include a list of accessories in this portion of the video, but that list got way too long, so I decided to break this out into its own video. I'll leave that video at the end and in the description, but it is important to have the right accessories with this gimbal, or know when to just not use any accessories at all and put an autofocus lens in front of a strong autofocus body and just run the gimbal as is. The next tip is to know how to swap between horizontal and vertical modes. The RS4 Pro's support plate allows you to quickly swap between horizontal and vertical shooting modes. And on smaller builds, like with an FX3 and a really small prime lens, you can get away with just balancing the tilt motor, recalibrating the motors, and you're good to go. However, if you're using larger setups like an FX6, where you really have to extend all of the axis arms out, that's when you're going to have to do some rebalancing. So even though you have to rebalance the motors when you're going from horizontal to vertical shooting, it's still way faster than taking your camera off the plate, moving the plate, and then putting it back on the camera, because you still have to adjust the motors anyways. My next tip is a nice quality of life upgrade here, but it is to pair your camera to the RS4 Pro via Bluetooth, and you can start and stop recording. And if you half press the button, it initiates autofocus on your Sony camera and other cameras. But if you are using a Sony camera and you have clear image zoom set up, if you pair your camera with Bluetooth and you're not using a focus motor, using this zoom rocker on the body of the RS4 Pro will actually use the clear image zoom of your Sony camera. Or if you have a power zoom lens, it will actually start the power zoom, so you don't have to reach to the body of the lens to do it. You can do it on the gimbal itself, which is pretty cool. My next tip is to use the RavenEye, but understand its limitations. It's a great remote viewing device to make quick adjustments to the gimbal. You can also use the gyroscope with your phone, so it'll track the gimbal movements based on your phone's movements. That's pretty cool if you need that. You can start and stop active track, but it can be tricked in low light situations and subjects that are moving very quickly. It does allow for some camera control if your camera supports it and you're using the right cables, but even then, the camera controls are pretty basic settings. The range is all right, but it uses your phone's connection, so you have to be within your cell phone's Wi-Fi signal range to be able to use the RavenEye. If you find yourself wanting more features than the RavenEye can provide, that's where the DJI transmission comes in. The price is very steep compared to the RavenEye, but it's also insane the amount of features that once you start adding more devices to the RS4 Pro, that can be integrated, and the high bright monitor is kind of the central station for all of the different settings and feed you can use when it comes to the DJI transmitter. This is using Wi-Fi. This is using a 7-kilometer signal that DJI uses in their drones. So it is a very clear picture, and it's much more reliable than using the RavenEye. That being said, it is significantly more expensive than the RavenEye. If you get the Pro kit, you get the RavenEye in the box with the gimbal. If you want to use the DJI transmitter, this is a whole separate purchase. However, if you do a lot of filmmaking, you can use this with handheld setups as well. You can also use the RavenEye with a handheld setup, but it's really limited on what it can do, and it's just transmitting an image to the app. This is transmitting an image to the high bright monitor that you can actually put on your camera and use instead of your small HD or your Atomos monitors. While there are 2 different image transmission systems for the RS4 Pro, this really does come down to how you use the gimbal and what you need for your shoots. This probably deserves its own video. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments down below. My next tip is to use the auto locks, but understand if you're using the new feature that is fully fold and lock, and you're using a bit of a setup like this, when you're balancing the setup, you have to extend the arms out farther. And if you're using fully fold and lock, your arms may actually hit the side of the gimbal, so it actually isn't able to fully fold and lock, but the gimbal doesn't know that, so it's going to just automatically try to fold and lock, and it will actually hit the arms on themselves. So if you're using smaller setups like the FX3 with a photo prime, you can get away with using fully fold and lock. If you're using more of a setup like this or an FX6, I would say using recenter and lock is an even better option. Recenter and lock is also important if you're using your gimbal in underslung mode, because your gimbal will just fold to lock to the center. But if you're using fold and lock, your gimbal may not know it's in underslung mode, and it will try to orient itself to lock in the regular upright position. And then when you go to turn your gimbal on again, it doesn't realize it's in inverted mode, and it will just try to balance out itself, and it may freak out a bit. If you're using your gimbal inverted or with larger setups, I would still use the automated gimbal locks, but I would make sure I'm in recenter and lock. My next tip is about cable management when it comes to the RS4 Pro and all of the accessories. Once you start adding more things to this gimbal, you're going to get more cables running everywhere. So it's really important to properly cable manage all of your cables. So if you're using the gimbal, you don't accidentally snag a cable or have something go around a gimbal arm. So whenever you try to move the gimbal arm around, it gets extra tension on the ports or won't move at all. It's really up to you to do the best cable management you can. Pay attention to your cable management, especially when you start building this out. My next tip is to adjust the display settings on the back of the gimbal. This RS4 Pro now has a display settings menu, and if you don't touch the screen, by default for 30 seconds, the screen will go into sleep mode. And I was finding 30 seconds after I was adjusting a setting on my gimbal, moving something around, and then coming back to my gimbal screen. 30 seconds wasn't enough, and I would have to constantly unlock this screen. So you can go in and adjust this from 30 seconds to 2 minutes. This will also help save battery life. When the screen is locked, it's a little bit dimmer. And it also helps avoid accidentally changing any of the settings on the back of the gimbal. I do think 30 seconds is a little limited, and I found myself constantly unlocking it, so I did find myself increasing it to 2 minutes. I'll get into the shortcuts in a second, but as a bonus tip here, you can customize the M button on the back of the gimbal. And if you have a camera paired with Bluetooth, you can control custom button 1 on your camera with the M button. Or if you have the Lidar, you can use it to toggle the autofocus and manual focus of the Lidar. I use it when I have my Lidar. I love using the M button to turn that on and off. if my subject will be going behind something, turning it to manual focus for a second and then reinitiating the autofocus is great for some shots. And I will be mapping C1 on my Sony cameras to toggle manual focus and autofocus when I'm using autofocus lenses. Now it's time to quickly go through the shortcuts for the RS4 Pro. If you don't know how to quickly access the different pages, or maybe you just need a little refresher, this part of the video is for you. For the power button, pressing once locks the gimbal motors. Pressing it again turns them on. Holding it turns the gimbal on and off. The gimbal follow mode switch toggles between pan, tilt, follow, and FPV modes. The M button is a custom button that I just went over in tip 11, but this can take a picture, adjust the Lidar manual focus or autofocus, or be mapped to custom or function button 1 on your camera if it's paired to Bluetooth. Holding down the M button enters sport mode, where the gimbal is more responsive to your movements. Holding M and double tapping the trigger will keep the gimbal in sport mode until you repeat those steps to take it out of sport mode. Holding down the M button and trigger will start an auto-tune calibration. This one is particularly handy on those shoot days where you're swapping stuff constantly. Being able to quickly do a auto calibration is a very handy trick to have up your sleeve. For the camera control button, short pressing uses the autofocus. Pressing it starts or stops recording or taking a photo. When using Lidar, half pressing locks the autofocus point, and when you release, the Lidar autofocus is enabled. For the trigger, pressing and holding enters lock mode. Pressing the trigger and tapping the screen will keep the gimbal in lock mode. Double tapping will recenter the gimbal. You'll use this all the time. If you have the Lidar or RavenEye attached, pressing the trigger once will start active track. For the front dial, you can customize the front dial in the screens. I'll go over that in a second, but I mapped mine to adjust the focus motor. For shortcuts, swiping down takes us to the control center screen. Here you can adjust the display settings or manage Bluetooth. You can also adjust the focus motor endpoints or remotely calibrate your gimbal motors. Here's where you have your general settings as well. I disabled selfie mode, set auto lock to recenter and lock, turned on silent mode. If your horizons are off, you can start a horizon calibration, start a gimbal auto check, or check the gimbal versions. Swiping from the right side is the create screen, allowing you to set up a time lapse, tracking shot, or panorama. Swiping from the left is the Lidar and image transmission feed. Using the gimbal with Lidar, this is where you'll set up your Lidar focus mode, lens calibration, and more. Swiping up gets you to the gimbal settings screen. Here you can adjust the joystick and dial settings, or customize the M button, trigger, or focus motor torque. The toggle on the left side of the gimbal allows you to select between gimbal control and zoom. If you have a Focus Pro motor set to zoom, this will adjust the zoom motor. And if you have a Sony camera paired to Bluetooth, this will adjust the power zoom or the clear image zoom. For the USB-C ports on the front of the RS4 Pro, they've changed around a little bit from the RS3. The camera control port is now on the back of the gimbal arm, and the front has 2 ports. The top is for the focus motor, and the bottom is for the image transmission or Lidar. For some reason, this makes it a little easier for my brain to remember which cable goes where. The RS4 Pro is a powerful gimbal with a lot of accessories. The beauty of this gimbal is that it can be as rigged out or as minimal as your shoot needs. It doesn't get faster than putting a small camera with an autofocus lens on this gimbal, but if you're working with a team, you can use the same gimbal and have a first AC pulling focus for you, and you can have the director having their own dedicated monitor out of the first AC's monitor. I'll be making more RS4 Pro videos in the future, so if there's anything you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments down below. And here is a link to my RS4 Pro accessories and review video, and I'll leave the Ronin playlist in the description if you'd like to see more. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.